This 1977 classic had a soundtrack that produced 4 #1 hits, and at the time was the biggest selling album of all time. That story and more next. Today's movie is a pop culture phenom. Was, still is, historic. It popularized the whole music genre, fashion, and got the movie and music business together like never before. Today's movie is Saturday Night Fever, 1977. This movie is about a young man, Tony Manero, who has problems in his family. They think he's a black sheep of the family, has friends that he has issues with, has a girl that likes him but he doesn't like her, has a job that's really not going to go anywhere. He really, I'm going to be in this working class neighborhood of New York and Brooklyn, and this is probably where I'm going to be my whole life. He didn't really have any thought that it was going to go anywhere else. But there was one place that he really enjoyed going to, and he looked forward to every week, and that was the discotheque. Now, discotheque back at that time, the music genre we're talking about is disco. This is the mid late 70s when the disco craze was on, and this movie epitomized that craze. And Tony, when he would go to the discotheque, all eyes would be on him. They knew, there's Tony Manero. He's the best dancer around here. And everybody clamored around to watch him dance. Now, Saturday Night Fever is based on an article from the New York Magazine written by Nick Cohn. It was called The Travel Rights of the New Saturday Night. And this ended up being a fictional article. Nick Cohn was to study and do an article, nonfiction article on the disco subculture in New York City. But he was from England and wasn't here for very long in doing this, so it was tough for him to really get a beat on doing this article. So he ended up actually making a fictional article, and nobody really ever knew or questioned him on it. And the lead character named Vincent, what this Tony Manero would be based off of, was actually a friend of his from England. So Robert Stigwood, who is a British music manager, saw this article though, and it got good press. Saw the article and thought this would be a good movie. I'm going to buy the rights to this, which he did. He asked Nick Cohn if he would do a screenplay, and he said he would. Norman Wexler was a part of this as well. In fact, I think he took on most of it than Cohn did, although I think Cohn did get some writing credit for it. And they wrote the screenplay. Directing this was going to be John Badham, who we had talked about before with War Games. So if you haven't seen the War Games episode, do that. He would do War Games in 6 years after this. Production went by, and casting was going to be, the casting was going to be interesting because their budget was going to be pretty low. To Robert Stigwood and everybody, this was a small little film where we don't have a lot of money for it that we're going to make. And so, or we're not going to put a lot of money anyway into it. But they were going with $3.5 million was their budget. Even then, not a lot. And so casting was going to be an issue. So what they ended up doing was they just ended up getting New York theater actors and other actors that were just beginning as well, so they would be paid less. The only real name in this, obviously, is going to be Tony Manero. Who is going to play that? That's going to be a lead. And the real only named actor and the get actor that they could get at this point would be John Travolta, who would then be Tony Manero. John Travolta, he came off 1976 doing Carrie, which actually was a very successful film. But really what his name was about in the business was through the sitcom Welcome Back, Kotter, which was very successful. So that's where John Travolta did have a name through that. But obviously this movie is going to send him in the stratosphere. The other thing that they did to keep within budget too was a shoot on location. So if you're watching this movie, this is all shot in the Brooklyn area of New York City. Okay, even the disco club, the discotheque that they use, was a real disco back at that time, called 2001 Odyssey. And they just did some sprucing up inside of it, but that was a real disco. All right, let's get into the soundtrack. The Bee Gees are synonymous with this movie and this soundtrack because they made a lot of the songs and they were all hits. As a matter of fact, their picture is on the soundtrack. Their picture's on the soundtrack. That speaks volumes right there. But the interesting was that they were not involved in this until post-production. Robert Stigwood called them and asked them if they had any songs that they can give, and they were like, "No, we don't. We're writing an album right now, and the songs we have we're trying to do is for this album. We don't have anything to give you." But they ended up actually working with Stigwood and said, "Okay, we'll make some songs," and they made some songs over a weekend that would become huge hits. They ended up blending a couple of songs they did a year or two prior in the soundtrack. We'll talk about them in a few seconds. But the other big hits were actually songs they wrote over a weekend. I believe they were in France. So these songs are put in post-production. As a matter of fact, in the nightclub scenes in the movie, when they were shooting those scenes, John Travolta is actually dancing to Stevie Wonder. He's not even dancing to the Bee Gees, which is what would be in the movie. The Bee Gees songs were added in post-production. So what songs are we talking about here? What were these hits? The Bee Gees performed and wrote songs for this album. So here's the songs they wrote and performed. And that was How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, Staying Alive, More Than a Woman, Jive Talkin', and You Should Be Dancing. Right? Those songs were written and performed by the Bee Gees. How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, and Staying Alive went number 1 in 1978. They were on the charts the same. Number 1 in 1978. All number 1 hits in 1978 from this album. Jive Talkin' and You Should Be Dancing were actually number 1s, but they were number 1s a year or two previously. And those were the songs that the Bee Gees lent to the album to be put on the soundtrack that they'd already actually done. But those were number 1. So if you add those onto it there, that's 5 right there. And then there was a number 1 that they wrote but didn't perform. It was performed by Yvonne Elliman, and that is If I Can't Have You. That was a number 1 that they wrote, but Yvonne Elliman sang it. So just absolutely historical. More Than a Woman was actually covered as well. Both of those versions, it was Tavares, I believe, that did it. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, that did that. They were an R&B group back at the time. They did a cover of that as well. Both those versions are actually in the movie. Okay, both those versions are in the movie. The soundtrack won a Grammy Award for Album of the Year. Only the 3rd soundtrack to ever do that. It's the 10th best-selling album of all time now. Back at that time of Saturday Night Fever, it was actually the best-selling album of all time, and was that until 1982 when Michael Jackson's Thriller overtook it. And it's sold over 40 million copies at this point today. What is the legacy of this movie? Saturday Night Fever was selected to be the United States National Film Registry. If you're in that, you're historic. It's went around $240 million it has made worldwide since its release. It's been in movies as a parody. Airplane in 1980. It was in Ready Player One 5 years ago in 2018, so pretty recent there for the most part. It was in that movie. Also Glee. and many more, many more. It just is you want to look at the 70s, a symbol of 70s culture, and it resonates today still. Yes, there's a lot of disco songs that were not very good, and I've heard some, on the radio or on YouTube, and I'm like, oh man, I remember when I liked that, but not anymore. But the songs on this album, particularly the Bee Gees, it is still good. And when I hear anything from disco, it seems on a radio anymore, it's a Bee Gees song from that album. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And, this song for me resonates as well, too, because I remember, this is one of the first, the songs from this album were the first songs I've ever heard in my life that I remember as a kid. Going kind of into elementary. I was that young. And so my first memories of music were Bee Gees songs from this album. And then I remember watching the movie, and I think it was 1980, because they made two versions of this movie. There was the original version was the rated R with a lot of adult situations, but then they ended up making a PG version. And they showed that one on TV, and I saw that. I think it was on ABC or NBC at the time. I remember watching that in 1980, and then HBO got the original, it got the rated R movie, one, but later down the line. But that's the one that I watched, the PG one. And they made that because there were so many kids, especially like young teen and teenagers, that could not see a rated R movie, were buying these albums, buying the soundtrack, but couldn't watch the movie. Couldn't go in the theater and watch the movie. So they made the PG version. Which I think, if you're that age, I think that's pretty cool that you did that. In fact, again, I saw it on television as well because of that. So, where can you watch this if you haven't seen this movie? Where can you watch this? Okay, if you have a subscription to any of these, you can watch it at these following places: Prime Video, Paramount Plus, Showtime, Sling, and Spectrum. Again, those are subscription. If you have a subscription, you can see them at those places. If you want to rent, and again, I think the rent's about $4 at these places, it is now at Row 8, Redbox, and Vudu. So please comment below and let's talk about this movie. If you've seen this movie, please comment below. Tell us what you thought of it. What are your memories of it? And if you haven't seen this movie, pull it up at those places I mentioned, one of those places I mentioned earlier, and watch it and come back and tell us what you think of it. So let's talk about this classic movie and soundtrack. Please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. I really appreciate it. And for next time, that's a wrap.